Dear students, this is the second lecture in the course of contract of sale. In the previous lecture, we have started with illustrating the definition of the contract of sale, and we also started with the first characteristic of the contract of sale, which is the consensuality nature or the consensual nature of the contract of sale. In this lecture, inshallah, we will continue illustrating and explaining the other characteristics of the contract of sale. So, as we mentioned previously, the contract of sale is a contract that is made between two persons. The first one is the seller, and the second party to this contract is the buyer. And there are two kinds of obligations. The first obligation is the obligation to transfer the ownership, and this is the seller's obligation. The second legal obligation is the obligation of the buyer, and which is giving a sum of money or submitting the sum of money, which is called the price legally, to the seller, who is the first party. So we have two parties, and it's important to mention each one's obligation to this contract. Simply, we mention these two important pillars or elements in the definition because they will distinguish the contract of sale from the other contracts, as we will see inshallah in the coming lectures. So the contract of sale, as we mentioned, also is a consensual contract. So every two persons can conduct the contract of sale among themselves without having or to follow any formal procedure in conducting the contract between them or concluding the contract between them. So they just need to first of all to give the offer, and the second party has to give his acceptance. In this case, when the acceptance is connected and linked with the offer, the contract is existed and it is concluded between the two parties without having to resort any formal process, as we mentioned previously. So the contract is made between them without the formality process or without the formal process. So however, despite the fact that the contract of sale is a consensual one, there are some kinds of the sales which requires a formal process or a formal nature, like the contract of sale regarding the ships. Like the sale of the ship, it must be a written one. So the formality here is needed and required for concluding the contract. So it's not required for proofing matters. So we have to differentiate between the formality which is required for concluding or for the existence of the contract and the formality which is needed only for the proofing matters. So I have to say that the general rule is that the contract of sale is a consensual one. So when you buy something from the supermarket, then you just need to express your need to buy something, and the seller has to accept this or must accept your offer or your need. When this happens, then the contract of sale exists. Okay, so no need to register the process that happened between you and him or her as a seller. But this, like, this doesn't prevent both of you from requiring the formality of this process. Like, you may buy something from the supermarket and you may agree with the seller that this process must be written. Look, the writing here is not needed or required for the, like, what we say, for the existence of the contract. It's only required for proofing matters, so that when there are kinds of conflict between you and the seller, you can resort to this evidence so that you prove you're right. Okay, so there is a difference, actually a big difference, between the formality which is required for proofing matters and the formality which is required for the existence of the contract. So when the formality is required for the existence of the contract, and you do not, you and the seller, follow the formality or the formal process which is needed by the law, then the penalty here in this case is that the contract between you and the seller would be a null contract. بيكون عقد باطل, simply because it lacks one of the elements or the pillars of the contract. However, if the formality is just for proving matters, so the contract is existed. However, you or the seller do not have a strong evidence or a powerful evidence. Okay, so there is difference between the formality which is required for proving matters or for the existence of the contract. So we finished talking about the first character, which is the consensuality, and now we will move to another character, which is that the contract of the sale is a two-sided and a two-sided binding effect. Well, actually, the contract of sale draws two kinds of obligations. The first obligation, as mentioned in the definition, I would like to annotate it through the bin. Well, this is the first obligation: to transfer the ownership of the sale or any other pecuniary right to the buyer. This is the obligation number one. And there is another obligation, which is for a certain sum of money that must be submitted from the buyer to the seller, and this is the obligation number two. When I say that the contract of sale is a two-sided binding contract, it means that there are two obligations. Every obligation of these two obligations shall like bound one of the parties of the contract of sale. So let's go back to our, okay, here. So it is a two-sided binding contract. This means that the contract of sale puts obligations on the side of both parties, the seller and the buyer, okay? So every one of these two persons is a creditor and debtor at the same time. So the seller is a creditor and debtor, and also the buyer is a creditor and a debtor at the same time. What do we mean by this? We mean that the seller is creditor regarding the price because the seller needs the price. So he is a creditor regarding the price. However, he is debtor at the same time because he must submit something to the buyer, which is the sold thing or the sale, شيء المبيع. Okay, so the seller here is a creditor regarding the price. However, he is debtor regarding the sale. While the opposite is the opposite concerns the buyer because he is the creditor regarding the receiving of the sale thing, like he needs it, and the debtor here is required to pay the seller the money. That's why he is a debtor regarding the price. So both of these parties to the contract of sale are creditor and debtor at the same time. That's what we mean by saying that the contract of sale is a two-sided binding contract. Consequently, and as a result here, if one of these parties fails to fulfill his obligations, the other party has the right to refrain from doing his obligations or to call for the rescission of the contract. Look, it's very important here to say that if I, as a seller, I don't want to submit the sale to the buyer, okay? Like me and Baha, for example, we concluded a contract of sale regarding Baha's car. Now I have the money and Baha has the car, and Baha is obliged to give me or to submit the car to me, okay? Now in this case, if Baha refrains from fulfilling his obligation, I mean to submit the car to me, then in this case I have also the right to refrain from doing my obligation and conducting my obligation, which is submitting or giving the money or the price to Baha. So this gives me, number one, to refrain from doing my obligation until the first party fulfills his obligation. So if Baha fulfills his obligation by giving me the car, then in this case I have to submit the price to him. Or even it gives me another choice that I may call for the rescission of the contract made between me and Baha. So there is difference between the nullity and the rescission of the contract. The nullity means that the contract, like, it doesn't have one of the pillars. So when one of these pillars of the contract is not existed, then the contract as whole would be null. However, when the elements and the pillars of the contract are found and they are all met, however, there are some clashes between the two parties, as one of them doesn't want to fulfill his obligations, then the other party may request for the rescission of the contract through resorting to the court and requesting for the rescission of the contract. So this is the difference between the rescission of the contract and the nullity of the contract. البطلان بتعلق بأركان العقد، في ركن من أركان العقد بيكون مفقود، فبالتالي بيكون العقد باطل، في حين ممكن يكون العقد مستوفي كل شروطه زي الحالة اللي صارت between me and Baha. All of the process is correct from the legal side, as the pillars of the contract are met. However, the problem is not with the pillars of the contract. The problem is with like regarding fulfilling the conditions of the contract, or the obligations that are included within this this contract. So when one of the parties doesn't want to fulfill his obligations, this would give the other party the right to refrain from doing his obligation until the first party like fulfills his obligation, or I have the right to resort to the court and to apply for the rescission or to request for the rescission of the contract. Okay, so we have to take into our consideration the difference between the rescission of the contract and the nullity of the contract. Okay, so that's what I mean by the second characteristic of the contract of sale. The contract of sale is a two-sided binding contract. The contract of sale is a consensual contract. Number 3, the contract of sale is a contract of exchange, يعني عقد البيع عقد تبادل. Or we may name it a commutative contract, عقد معاوضة. So commutative means معاوضة in the Arabic language, or a contract of exchange. Why do we say that the contract of sale is a contract of commutation or a commutative contract? Simply because every party to this contract receives an opposite for what he submits. So the buyer gives the sold thing in opposite of the price, and vice versa. Like the buyer, he submits the price in opposite of what he submits, which is the sale or the sold thing. So there is no intention of donation. يعني النية الموجودة هي نية تبادل وليست نية ايه؟ ما فيش نية تبرع، ما فيش نية اني اعطيك شيء بدون مقابل. So there is no intention of donation in contract of sale. في عقد البيع انسى انه في شيء اسمه نية التبرع. So the seller gives the sale and receives the price, and the buyer does the opposite. What do we mean by this? We mean that the buyer, he gives the price, however he receives the sale. Okay, so that what is meant by the contract of exchange, or the contract of the sale as contract of exchange. It is not sufficient to have an opposite in this contract. So he says here that it's not sufficient to have an opposite in this contract. It is necessary that the price must be a sum of money. So if I give Baha like 2 cars in opposite of receiving, for example, a building, then this is not a contract of sale. The contract of sale means that the seller gives the sale to the buyer. However, the buyer shall submit a sum of money, a price. So there must be money that must be submitted from the seller, from the buyer to the seller. So if there is an opposite, but the opposite is not a sum of money, then this is not a contract of sale. However, it is a contract of swap. The swap means عقد مقايضة. مقايضة means a thing. It means a thing in opposite of another thing. Okay, so when the opposite is not a sum of money, then this is not a contract of sale, while it is only a contract of swap. Okay, so this is the third characteristic of the contract of sale, that the contract of sale is a contract of exchange. Okay, now let us move to the fourth characteristic of the contract of sale. The contract of sale is an ownership transferring contract. Means that the contract transfers the ownership from the seller to the buyer. This contract aims at transferring the ownership of the sold thing or the sale, or any pecuniary right, real right or personal right, because you will study this at the 4th level, that the pecuniary rights are 2 types: real rights or personal rights. Personal rights, it means the debts, like when we make like transferring the debt from a person to another person. Like I need like $10,000 from Baha. Okay, so I'm the creditor and Baha is the debtor. Okay, now Noor is my creditor and I'm debtor to Noor with $10,000 the same time. Let me write it here so that you can understand. Like, where is it then? Here's Maher, okay, and here's Baha. Maher needs from Baha $10,000, okay? I need $10,000. However, Noor needs $10,000 from me as Maher. So Noor is my creditor and I am the creditor of Baha. Okay? So I may tell Noor that, look at me, Noor, I have $10,000 as personal right or debt that I need them from Baha. Okay? So I want you to sell me your car an opposite of a price, but this price is a sum of money that I don't have currently, but you may take them from Baha. Okay, so the price here is a sum, is not a sum of money. It is what? It is a personal right. Okay, so the price may be a personal right. You will study this precisely at the level 4. Anyway, this contract aims at transferring the ownership of the sale or any other pecuniary rights from the seller to the buyer. Now, the owner may transfer at the time of formulating the contract. The ownership, الملكية, it's like a question. You just write it here. When does, or what is the moment mean? When does the ownership transfer from the seller to the buyer? Okay, so what is the time? When does the ownership transfers from the seller to the buyer? Look, the ownership may transfer at the time of formulating the contract. ممكن الملكية تنتقل بمجرد انعقاد العقد. When the sale is a specific movable thing. إذا كان البيع الشيء المبيع منقول محدد بالذات زي السيارة مثلا أو أي شيء آخر من المنقولات المحددة بالذات، فإن ملكيتها تنتقل بمجرد انعقاد العقد. أنا اليوم بدي أبيع الكنب مني لبهاء، أوكي؟ بمجرد ما أنا وياه جينا وقفنا وقلنا لبعض بعتك، ويقول لي هو أنا اشتريت وسلمته المبلغ المالي، بيكون ملكية الكنب انتقلت ليه. حتى لو كانت موجودة في بيته هي بتصير ملكي، لأنه الشيء المنقول زي الكنب المعين بالذات، لأنه احنا حكينا المنقول المعين بالذات زي الأشياء زي الكنب مثلا، ونحدده بذاته، ونقول الكنب اللي لونه أحمر اللي كذا، ونحدد مواصفاته تحديد نافي للجهالة عنه. بمجرد اني انا حددت هذا الشيء تحديد نافي للجهالة عنه، هو بطبيعته منقول، هذا بسميه منقول معين بالذات، احنا بنسميه specific movable thing. So if the sale is a specific movable thing, then the ownership transfers from the seller to the buyer at the time of formulating the contract. في وقت إبرام العقد تنتقل ملكيته. خلاص ما دام اتفقنا صار ملك إلي، حتى لو موجود في بيته، بس بتضل عملية التسليم يعني المطلوبة منه إنه يسلمني إياه ويصير هذا الشيء موجود عندي. أوكي؟ طيب شغلة ثانية. طيب النوع الثاني it may like we mean the ownership, it may transfer sorry after following a certain procedure. ممكن الملكية ما تنتقلش بمجرد انعقاد العقد، ممكن تنتقل لكن بشرط انه نتبع اجراء معين، اذا اتبعناه بتنتقل الملكية، اذا ما اتبعناهوش لا تنتقل الملكية. طبعا هذا بكونش بالنسبة للمنقولات المعينة بالذات، في حاجة اسمها المنقولات المعينة بالنوع اللي احنا بنسميها sales or the sale that are or the sales that are decided by their type or type decided sales that we write it here. So movable, the movables, number one, a specific بنسميها specific movable, specific movables, and these movables ownership they transfer at the time of contracting or at the time of formulating the contract. And number two, the type decided movables احنا بنسميها أو things، يعني الأشياء المعينة بالنوع، أشياء معينة بالنوع. هذه زي إيش الأشياء المعينة بالنوع؟ زي مثلا لما نيجي نتكلم عن الزيتون أو الزيت أو القماش إلى آخره. لما أجي أقول لبهاء بدي أشتري منك 10 طن من يعني الزيتون وبدي إياهم يكونوا من النوع السري مثلا، هذه أشياء مش معينة بالذات، ها إيش معينة بالنوع، لأن أنا قلت له بدي 10 كيلو من الزيتون السري، وتخيل إنه بهاء عنده مخزن والمخزن فيه 50,000 كيلو، تقول لي هذا شيء معين بالذات؟ ما بقدرش أعينه بالذات. كيف بده يكون تعيينه؟ بيكون تعيينه بالنوع، بقول له بدي منك من المخزن هذا بدي 10 كيلو من اللي نوعه سري. ملكيته لا تنتقل بمجرد انعقاد العقد، لأنه أنا إيش بعرفني من بين ال 50,000 كيلو ولا 10 تبعوني. فالعملية اللي بتنتقل فيها الملكية أو الإجراء اللي لازم نتبعه عشان تنتقل ملكية هذا الشيء المعين بالذات اللي هو ال 10 كيلو زيتون، عشان ينتقلوا من السيلر to the buyer we have to resort a process named the resorting or the sorting عفوا. يعني عملية الفرز، فرز الشيء، يعني ساعة ما يفرز لي الزيتون ال10 كيلو من بين ال 50,000 كيلو بتكون ملكيته انتقلت من مين؟ من the seller to the buyer. So when the thing is a type decided one, then the ownership of this thing or these things shall transfer from the seller to the buyer after resorting a specific procedure. For example, the specific procedures regarding the type decided thing is here, look here, the sorting. So the sorting is the process by which the ownership of the thing, the type decided thing, transfers from the seller to the buyer. Okay? Or it may that the ownership of the thing it must or the party to the contract, they must follow a certain procedure rather than the sorting in order to move the ownership of this thing from the seller to the buyer. Like when the thing is not a movable, for example, let me write them again here. So the first thing is specific movable, and we have mentioned that the ownership of these things, it transfers at the time of formulating the contract. Number two, the type decided thing or movable, it transfers from the seller to the buyer after resorting the procedure named the sorting. Number three, the immovable things. The immovable things. The immovables يعني real estates، العقارات. العقار ملكيته لا تنتقل بمجرد انعقد العقد زي السبيسيفيك موفابلز، ولا بمجرد الفرز، لانه ايش ده فرز؟ ده فرز عقار ما هو مفرزه خالص، انما تنتقل ملكيته بعد اجراء حاجه بنسميها او اجراء شيء بنسميه the registering، التسجيل. وين هذا بكون؟ بنروح على دائره اسمها الطابو، وبننقل بننقل الملك من سجلات الشخص السيلر to the buyer. So if the contract regarding the real estates according to the Palestinian penal Palestinian civil code, if the buyer sells his real estate to the the seller sells his real estate to the buyer and they concluded a contract and they named this contract a final contract of sale of the real estate, then this is null. This contract is totally null. Why? Because it needs a formal procedure, which is the registering. هيجي واحد يقول لي طب كيف الناس بتبيع الشقق اللي هي عقارات بمجرد عقد؟ اطلع في اسمه حتلاقيه اسمه preliminary contract of sale، عقد ابتدائي. وقتش بيصير نهائي؟ when we register the contract in the circle which registers the ownership transferring from the seller to the buyer. Okay, so this is what we wanted to say regarding the types of the things and how does the ownership of these things transfers from the seller to the buyer, and what is the time that their ownership transfers from the seller to the buyer. بهيك تقريبا بننتهي حديثنا عن موضوع عقد البيع وخصائص عقد البيع. مجددا بنحب نذكر انه the definition of the contract of sale is very important. You have to mention all of the pillars and the elements of the definition simply because they differentiate between the contract of sale and the other contracts. So you have not to miss any of these like elements. Number two, the contract of sale has many features. Number one, it is a consensual contract. The consensuality here, it doesn't it is not considered as one of the public order rules. That's why it may that the parties agree that the contract may follow a certain procedure in order to exist, not for proving matters. And here I mentioned something new today regarding the formality. The formality, it may be needed for just proving matters, and it may be required for the existence of the contract. Also, we have mentioned the two-sided binding contract here as one of the characteristics of the contract of sale. Also, we now know the difference between the rescission of the contract and the nullity of the contract. So it's one of the most important points of our lecture today. The contract of sale is a contract of exchange, and now we know what do we mean by the exchange here, and what is the exchange, what is the opposite that is needed from the buyer, which is the price, only the price, the sum of money, not something in opposite of the sold thing, because it is a swap contract, then it's not a contract of sale. And finally, we have mentioned the types of the things and when do these types ownership transfer from the seller to the buyer. You have to differentiate between these things, the specific movable thing, the type decided thing, and the immovables, which in which the ownership transfers at the time of the registering. بتوقع اني هيك بكون يعني انهيت حديثي عن the characteristics of the contract of sale. Thank you for your patience, and I will see you inshallah in the coming lecture. Thank you and good.